proud U.S. veteran and a first generation Mexican American. And I want to talk about something that's been bothering me for years: how America whitewashes patriotic holidays like Memorial Day. And by that, I mean the way that our country's celebrations often erase or straight up ignore Black, immigrant, Native American, and Latino people's sacrifice for this nation. For example, one of the earliest Memorial Day commemorations was actually held by formerly enslaved African Americans in Charleston, South Carolina in 1865. About 10,000 people, mostly freed slaves, gathered on May 1st to honor Union soldiers who died liberating them. This incredible event, Black Americans literally inventing Memorial Day, was largely forgotten because, well, it didn't fit white residents' version of what the war was about. So, in other words, it was whitewashed from history. Whitewashing, it's when the contributions of people of color get painted over in plain white. And as a Latina veteran, on a day like Memorial Day, that hits close to home. If we forget those Charleston freedmen, who else are we forgetting? Can I trust anything I've learned in history books? So I want to have a real conversation about it, no matter how uncomfortable this is. And I want to talk about how it feels when patriotic holidays seem like they're only for some Americans. I want to talk about belonging, about why I simultaneously love Memorial Day and feel alienated by it. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, I invite you to hear me out. We don't have to agree, but I hope you're open to at least hearing my perspective. So let's dive in. Minority communities have always, always been part of America's military story. This country wouldn't exist without foreign helpers. From the Revolutionary War onward, immigrants have served in every major conflict in U.S. history. And they weren't just extras in the background either. They often filled crucial roles on the front lines. During the Civil War, for example, over 20% of Union soldiers were foreign born. Now, they were mostly Irish and German, so technically immigrants that today would broadly be considered part of mainstream whiteness. But historically, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, they weren't always treated as such. They were often racialized as not quite white, and they were seen as inferior or foreign and excluded from the dominant Anglo-American identity, which is exactly what I'm referring to. So this means that 1 in 5 Union soldiers fighting to end slavery was an immigrant. In World War I, about 500,000 immigrants wore the U.S. uniform, roughly 18% of all American soldiers. And after that war, 192,000 immigrant veterans became U.S. citizens as a reward for their service. It didn't stop there. Hundreds of thousands of immigrants fought in World War II and every conflict since. Between 250,000 and 500,000 Latinos served in World War II, but their contribution is virtually unknown to American public. 500,000 Latino Americans risked life and limb to defeat fascism, yet you barely know it from most history books or Hollywood movies. That's a pretty glaring omission. And it's exactly what I mean by whitewashing. Our stories have been missing in action from the national narrative for way too long. And it's not just World War II. Latinos and immigrants have bled for this country in Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf, the War on Terror, you name it. We have always been in the ranks. We've always saluted the flag and sometimes come home under that flag folded in a coffin. Yet when Memorial Day rolls around, do you hear our names read out? Do you see our faces on TV? Rarely. Instead, the image of the American soldier we honor is almost always presented as white, Mayflower descended, real American. That narrow image really hurts. It makes people like me feel invisible. And I know I'm not alone. Growing up as a Mexican American kid, I always had this uneasy feeling around the patriotic holidays. Memorial Day, 4th of July, Veterans Day. In our little world, those holidays were a big white deal. As a little girl, I didn't really understand the excitement. Nobody on TV who cared about these holidays looked like me. The speeches were all about honoring our forefathers. In the history segments at school, it was all General Washington, General Patton, all great, but all white. Meanwhile, immigrants' contribution to America was almost invisible in those stories. I started to feel like these patriotic parties were an exclusive club. It was like, this day is about honoring Americans, but not you people, just the real Americans. And of course, no one said that to me explicitly, but it was heavily implied. That's how it comes across to someone like me watching from the sidelines. I remember one Memorial Day in middle school, the teacher asked if anyone in our family had served, and I I had no idea why it was such a big deal at the time, but I do remember feeling completely excluded. I, more than anything, just wanted a grandfather that was a World War II vet just so that I could fit in. And that message sank in deep. Well, maybe we're not meant to claim this patriotic heritage. Maybe Memorial Day isn't for families like mine. And that feeling only got more confusing when I myself enlisted. I love this country. It's the only country I know. It's where I was born and where I've always lived. I mean, I lived in England, but that's because I was stationed there through the military. But the point is, I was ready to fight for this country, even die for it if I had to. But even in uniform, I experienced little moments, a sideways comment, a question about where I'm really from that always reminded me that some folks still didn't see me as fully American. And just imagine going to war for a country and coming home to feel like you don't belong. It messes with your head and it messes with your heart. It definitely impacted my sense of belonging. I've talked to other women veterans and immigrant vets who feel the same, a mix of pride in our service and pain that our service is often overlooked. So when Memorial Day comes, I feel proud to honor my fallen brothers and sisters, but I also feel this ache. An ache that says, where are our stories? What else have I been misled about? Why did I have to be grown before I learned, for instance, that Memorial Day might not even exist without Black people? And I want to talk about those hidden stories, the ones that could have made a young me feel included, had I only heard them. So here are a few that frankly every American should know. So like I mentioned, the first Memorial Day wasn't General so and so laying a wreath. It was Black people fresh out of slavery leading the way in Charleston, South Carolina, spring of 1865. The Civil War had just ended. The city was in ruins and the Confederates had fled. There was a former race course that had been used as a makeshift Confederate prison camp. At least 257 Union soldiers died there from disease and were dumped in a mass grave. The local Black community, many of them newly emancipated slaves, said, no, this isn't right. They reburied those Union soldiers properly in gratitude for their sacrifice and built an archway over the cemetery, calling them martyrs of the race course. And then on May 1st, 1865, They held a parade of 10,000 people, mostly Black residents, to honor the fallen. 3,000 Black school children carried flowers to decorate the graves and sang the Union anthem, John Brown's Body. So the Glory, Glory, Hallelujah, that song. Black ministers preached, Black Union regiments marched in solidarity. This was Memorial Day, born from Black Americans' grief and pride, where the people most marginalized in America paid tribute to those who fought for freedom. And so that story is quite powerful. Enslaved people had just been freed, and instead of merely celebrating their freedom, their first instinct was to honor the soldiers who died to make it happen. And it's such a beautiful, selfless origin for a Memorial Day. You'd think we would embrace the story. And yet, how many of us grew up hearing it? I sure didn't. This ceremony in Charleston happened 3 years before General John A. Logan, a white Union veteran, issued a proclamation in 1868 that led to the official National Memorial Day. But Logan gets the credit in most textbooks, while the Charleston event was suppressed from memory and forgotten nationally for a century. When I first learned this as an adult, I was pretty angry. I was angry that such a significant piece of history was kept from us, but I was also inspired because it proves something profound, that people of color have always been at the heart of American patriotism, even if the history books left them out. And so that's why I started with this story. It sets the stage for everything else. Now, jump forward to the 1940s. This next story blows my mind every time. Felix Longoria was a Mexican American from Three Rivers, Texas, a tiny town, who joined the army during World War II. He fought and died in action in the Philippines in 1945 towards the end of World War II. So he was a hero by any measure. He earned a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star for his service. But Felix's story isn't just about how he died. It's about what happened after his death, when his body finally came home years later. It took the army 4 years to recover Felix Longoria's remains and send them back to his hometown. And his widow went to the only funeral home in Three Rivers to arrange a wake, so the community could pay respects to this fallen soldier. And the funeral director flat out refused. He told Felix's wife, the whites won't like it. Because Felix was Mexican American, the funeral home would not allow his family to hold a wake in the chapel. This man died fighting for America, and back home, he was treated like a second-class citizen, even in death. The director did offer to bury Felix in the segregated Mexican section of the cemetery, which was literally fenced off with barbed wire, but no wake in the main chapel. Otherwise, it would upset the white townsfolk. And of course, hearing that today would sound ridiculous. Like, what if someone said they couldn't have a proper memorial service because whites wouldn't like it? It's grotesque. Well, Felix Longoria's community thought so too. Outraged Mexican American veterans in Texas spread the word. Dr. Hector Garcia of the American GI Forum, a civil rights group for Latino veterans, took up the cause and wrote letters to officials. And the story reached a freshman U.S. senator from Texas at the time, a guy named Lyndon B. Johnson. Yep, the one who'd later become president. LBJ was furious when he heard about the prejudice Felix's family had faced. And then Johnson made an extraordinary offer. He arranged for Felix Longoria to be buried with full honors at Arlington National Cemetery near Washington, D.C. And so this way, Felix received the hero's honor he deserved, far from the bigotry of Three Rivers. And on February 16th, 1949, Felix Longoria was finally laid to rest at Arlington with Senator Johnson, his wife, Lady Bird, and a representative of the president standing by his grieving family. Felix became the first Mexican American soldier killed in World War II to be buried at Arlington. Out of the 400,000 plus Mexican Americans who served in the war, he was the first to receive that recognition. The whole incident, of course, made national headlines. It was a huge civil rights turning point for Latino veterans. They realized that to claim their dignity, they had to fight for their place in the American story, even after fighting America's wars. Felix Longoria died a hero, but of course, not before racism tried to erase that. The Longoria affair is now taught in Mexican American history classes as a key moment, but I bet most Americans have never heard of it. Now I want to introduce you to Master Sergeant Roy P. Benavidez because because if there's ever a story that deserves to be a Hollywood movie, it's his. Roy was a Texan like Felix, born to a Mexican father and a Yaqui Native American mother. He grew up dirt poor, faced racism and hardship, and still volunteered for the army, eventually joining the elite special forces in Vietnam. One day in May 1968, Roy Benavidez heard that a 12-man special forces team, some of his buddies, were ambushed and surrounded by hundreds of enemy troops in the jungle. The situation was desperate. Roy jumped onto a rescue helicopter, armed with only a knife and his medical kit, and he jumped from the hovering chopper into the combat zone and ran through gunfire to reach the trapped man. And so what followed was 6 hours of pure heroism and hell. Roy was everywhere on the battlefield, dragging wounded men to safety, tending to injuries, calling in air support, and firing back at the enemy. He was shot multiple times, hit by shrapnel, and even stabbed in hand-to-hand combat. He was throwing wounded guys over his shoulder, refusing to stop despite one wound after another. Grenade fragments in his back, bullets in his leg, face, and head. He saved at least 8 men's lives through his actions that day. By the time a rescue helicopter finally got them out, Roy was so badly injured that his comrades thought he was dead. They put him in a body bag. And as the doctor was zipping it up, Roy spat in the doctor's face just to let him know that he was alive. Roy had 37 separate wounds from bullets, bayonets, and shrapnel. 37. Yet, miraculously, he survived. Now, you'd think a story like this would be shouted from the rooftops. Roy Benavidez did receive medals. The Army gave him a Distinguished Service Cross and 4 Purple Hearts for that day. But the higher-ups initially had issues at awarding him the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award, because of technicalities. You needed an eyewitness to recommend it, and the paperwork window had closed. Years went by. It wasn't until 1981, a full 13 years later, that another soldier who'd been there came forward as a witness. And so finally, President Reagan presented Roy Benavidez with the Medal of Honor in a long overdue ceremony. I don't blame him. That's a pretty hard story to believe. Master Sergeant Benavidez' story does get told in military circles. He's a legend to many who served, but how many average Americans know his name? When we talk about military heroes, people mention white guys like Audie Murphy, who was the World War II hero turned actor, and who also inspired the fictional character Rambo. I wish Roy Benavidez could be just as famous. He's proof that Latino Americans have earned a place in the list of American heroes over and over. I have one more story, and this one really brings it into the present. So this is about Lance Corporal José Antonio Gutiérrez. And if you've never heard of him, I truly believe you should. So Jose was born in Guatemala. By the time he was a young teenager, he was orphaned and living on the streets, basically scraping by in a very rough situation. At age 14, he made the incredibly dangerous journey alone from Guatemala through Mexico, hopping freight trains to reach the United States. I can't even imagine the desperation and bravery that it takes for a 14-year-old riding a train known as La Bestia or the Beast up north with nothing but hope. But Jose had a dream. He wanted a better life and he wanted to eventually bring his sister out of poverty in Guatemala. When Jose got here, he was undocumented, but he was also a refugee in spirit, a kid fleeing hardship. He ended up in LA in the foster care system, and despite all the odds, he thrived. He learned English, finished high school, and even started community college. Jose gained legal residency status by age 18. He had dreams of becoming an architect one day, but he also had a more immediate plan, which was he wanted to earn his citizenship. So Jose joined the U.S. Marine Corps. When the Iraq War began in 2003, Lance Corporal José Gutiérrez was part of the first wave of troops sent in. And unfortunately, he also became one of the very first killed in action in the Iraq War. Jose was killed by enemy fire at the age of 22, a formerly undocumented immigrant from Guatemala. He had been a Marine for less than a year. But here's the part that really gets me. Jose Gutierrez was not yet an American citizen when he died. He died wearing the American flag on his shoulder, but not having the full rights of a citizen on paper. The military and government, to their credit, honored him highly. In fact, in death, Jose was granted the American citizenship as a way to thank him for his service and sacrifice. Jose's story encapsulates the immigrant veteran experience, patriotism mixed with irony. He was one of an estimated 300 plus foreign-born U.S. soldiers who died in Iraq and Afghanistan in the 2000s. So yeah, these were people who literally gave everything for a nation that sometimes debates whether they even belong here. You get the point. Memorial Day is about honoring those who fell in service. And here's a young man who embodied service and the hope of immigrants. Yet, how many Memorial Day speeches mention him or the many like him? He deserves to be remembered, not as a token immigrant who died, but as an American hero. Period. His story, like Felix Longoria's, like Roy Benavidez, should be a part of what we talk about when we talk about sacrifice. And so now it's 2025, and I want to take a look at where we are. So we've just recounted stories of Black Americans, Mexican Americans, and immigrant Americans who should loom large in our patriotic memory, yet too often they don't. And I love to tell you that by 2025, we've fixed all that, but it's just not true. We haven't. In fact, we live in a time with some pretty ugly anti-immigrant and racist rhetoric flying around. It's a weird contrast. We say we honor all who served, but in the next breath, some politicians turn around and demonize immigrants or act like only certain people are real Americans. Case in point, there are veterans of the U.S. military who've been deported from the United States. After fighting for this country, some vets were kicked out and sent back to countries they barely knew. It's hard to even get exact numbers because immigration authorities didn't always track veteran status, but organizations estimate that hundreds of U.S. military veterans have been deported over the years. Hundreds. Men and women who signed up, some even got wounded in war, later got deported for one reason or another. As of this year, it's estimated around 9,400,000 U.S. veterans are not U.S. citizens. That's almost 100,000 people who served but could still be told, sorry, you're not one of us, and removed. The Biden administration started a program to bring some deported vets back and to protect those here from being deported, which is a step in the right direction. But the fact that it ever happened in the first place tells you a lot about how we treat immigrant veterans in our national psyche. We want their service when it's convenient, but we don't want to hear their stories at the barbecue. And then there's the broader climate. We're still hearing language in politics that paints immigrants as criminals, invaders, not American, you name it. Just think about that. Who gets monuments and who gets forgotten? For the longest time, we literally had U.S. Army bases named after Confederate generals, men who fought against the United States, many to preserve slavery. But meanwhile, true American heroes of color and immigrant heroes got very little recognition. We're finally starting to correct that. In 2023, for example, the Army base Fort Hood in Texas was renamed Fort Cavazos after General Richard Cavazos. Cavazos was a Mexican-American, Korean, and Vietnam War hero and the Army's first Hispanic four-star general. Fort Hood had been originally named after a Confederate, but now it honors a Latino patriot, a man who actually earned that honor by defending the United States. And that's just the kind of shit we need in our public memory, too. It sends a message. We will honor those who truly served, and they come from all backgrounds. It's been a struggle, and it continues. So, on this Memorial Day 2025, the climate is still challenging. There's fear mongering about immigrants at the border. There are attacks on programs that allow immigrants to serve. There's also still plenty of everyday racism that makes veterans of color feel like their countrymen don't fully accept them. I'd be lying if I said I don't still sometimes feel like that little girl wondering if I truly belong. But here's the thing. I refuse to accept being erased. And I think the tide is slowly turning. We are reclaiming that space in the national memory. We're saying our patriotism is just as real, our sacrifices just as worthy. And for me, reclaiming Memorial Day really just means expanding the narrative. Memorial Day is often described as a day of national unity, but you can't have real unity if whole chunks of your nation are left out of the story. Unity comes from truth and inclusion. Every American has a claim to our flag's story. We don't need permission to be patriotic. We are patriotic. And the whole "you're not a real American" crap really needs to die. America belongs to anyone who contributes to it, including illegal immigrants. This is our home. We've earned our place here many times over, and no amount of whitewashing can change that. Thank you so much for listening and for learning with me about these stories. See you in the next one.